time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
Star Wars, The Spirit of Life Day, Book 6 of the Life Day Treasury, by George Mann, 2021. Set in 20 BBY, the tale takes place on the planet Manta, where Life Day has come to stand for something far more sinister. Created and read by the Archivist Publishing. All across the galaxy, Life Day has come to symbolize love, peace, and remembrance. From Kashyyyk to Batuu, wherever the festival is celebrated, people come together in happiness and joy to spend time with their loved ones and give thanks for all the good things in their lives. But there is one little-known place on the planet Manta where Life Day has come to stand for something far more sinister. For here stands the site of one of the most harrowing massacres of the Clone Wars, where, one Life Day, many years ago, a droid army swept through the town, leaving a trail of devastation and death in their wake. The town has never recovered from that fateful day. To speak of Life Day in Ods Town is to invoke utter dread. There, people cower at the very thought of that fateful anniversary. And to remember the past is to invite untold terror into one's life. For on Life Day each year, the dead of Ods Town rise to haunt the living. It begins with a terrible wind that stirs the treetops and whistles through the streets, whipping the Fatirs into a frenzy. This is followed by the sound of tramping droid feet, heavy and regimented, echoing down the empty lanes. Then the ghostly sounds of blaster fire and vocalizers.
Copy, copy. Blast them!
An echo of what once passed as the droids marched on the town, followed by the screams and moans of the long dead as they play out scenes from that terrible day. Once again crumpling to their doom. This wailing and moaning lasts throughout the entire night. A harrowing dirge as the angry spirits rattle the doors and windows of people's homes and the ghostly droids march on. Blasting indiscriminately as they herd their victims through the streets. It is only with the rising of the sun the next morning that the spirits are finally banished for another year, drifting away like wisps of gossamer fog on the dawn breeze. Each Life Day, the people of Ods Town shelter in their homes, barricading the doors and chanting old songs to block out the terrified screams of the ghostly shades that would see them brought to ruin, dragged into the streets to swell the ranks of the dead. So it was that one Life Day a young girl named Emmy found herself closeted away in her parents' hab while the wind howled and the relentless march of the phantom droids grew louder and louder in the distance. Now, Emmy was a sensible child who mostly did as she was told, for she knew that her parents loved her and had only her best interests at heart. Yet that particular Life Day, she was refusing wholeheartedly to back down from an argument, for someone she loved dearly had put himself in terrible danger.
You must stay inside,
Cried her mother.
or the ghosts will steal you away from us and make you one of them forever.
I forbid you from going outside.
bellowed her father.
You will remain in here with us. It's too dangerous.
But Hector...
argued Emmy, for only moments earlier her terrified pet Vorpack, startled by the blood-curdling cries from the window, had burrowed down through a hole in the floorboards and shot out of the house, darting off into the wind-swept streets beyond. Through a crack between the planks of the boarded-up window, Emmy had watched him go, scurrying in fright as the wind swirled up dust devils in his path.
I'm sorry, Emmy,
said her father, softening and wrapping an arm around her shoulders.
We know how much you love Hector, but it's simply too dangerous to go out there after him.
He stroked her hair.
Now try not to listen to those horrible sounds. It'll all be over soon enough. We'll get you another Vorpack tomorrow.
But I don't want another Vorpack,
said Emmy.
I want Hector.
We know, darling.
Said her mother.
But Hector has gone, and there's nothing any of us can do.
Distraught, Emmy ran to her room and slammed the door shut behind her. She laid on the bed, listening to the terrible moaning coming from the street outside, filled with the echoes of years long past, with the horrible anguish of those unquiet spirits unable to find peace even beyond the grave. She knew she should have been scared, but all she could think about was little Hector, out there alone and petrified. Why had he run? The foolish creature should have known that she would never let anything happen to him. Hadn't she always promised him that, whispering softly in his ear as she stroked his downy fur? Emmy sat up on her bed, struck by the thought.
I promised him. I told Hector that I would always keep him safe. How could I even think about leaving him out there now, to face the ghosts alone?
Decision made, Emmy jumped down from her bed, slipped on her jacket, and crossed to the window in her room. She opened the glass pane. The chill night air seeped in through the cracks in the wooden boards. A shiver ran down her spine, her skin prickling along her arms. Shaking with fear, but emboldened by the knowledge that Hector needed her, Emmy climbed up onto her chest of drawers, braced herself against the window frame, and kicked hard until one of the boards finally broke loose. It fell to the ground outside with a clatter. The wind whipped in, stirring Emmy's hair like the sudden chilling breath of the dead.
Emmy? Are you all right in there?
Her mother's concerned voice sounded from the hall outside her bedroom door.
I'm okay, Mom.
She replied.
Just fetching down a box of old clothes. Nothing to worry about.
She waited until the sound of her mother's footsteps had receded and then, with a deep breath, wriggled out through the gap in the boards and dropped down to the street outside. Almost immediately, she wished she hadn't. The atmosphere was charged with an unnatural cold, and the wind scattered dust from the dirt road in swirling drifts, stinging her eyes and causing her to cough and splutter. The light of the twin moons shone down like glassy eyes, stark and staring. Close by, she could hear the low moaning of several shades, the rat-a-tat-tat of their banging on the doors and windows. If one of them caught her out here, well, she'd been warned 100 times what would happen. She fought against a rising tide of panic. Hector. She had to think of Hector.
Which way had he gone?
She thought. From the window. She'd seen him dart across the road and down an alleyway along the side of a ramshackle common house. That was where she'd start. Once, soon after she'd first gotten him, he'd managed to give her the slip, and after hours of searching, her father had found him nestled by the trash round the back of that same common house, which the locals knew as Moss's place. That's where she'd start. Chance was he'd have made for the same hiding place, and she'd be back home within minutes before her parents had even realized she was gone. It was strange, seeing the streets so deserted, so silent. Usually the night would be bustling with life, and the music from the band at Moss's place would be spilling out in a cacophony of drums, flutes, and viatars. She danced to it often enough with her father, who would chuckle as he swung her around their hab, brimming with joy and broad smiles. Out here, though, those nights seemed a long way away, and the only sounds remained the sorrowful lament of the dead and the ever-encroaching thump of the ghost droids' marching feet. As she crossed the street, she thought she sensed someone behind her and wondered for a moment if her father had spotted her and come after her. But when she turned, there was no one there. Just a passing sprinkle of dust on the wind. Biting her lip, she ran for the alleyway. It was dark here, and the shadows seemed to close in from all sides. Emmy crept along, careful not to make a sound. Up ahead, a heaped pile of garbage bags made a stark silhouette, monstrous and misshapen.
Hector? Hector?
She hissed.
Where are you?
Something sounded behind her. The scrape of a booted foot. She swallowed, her throat constricting, her mouth suddenly dry.
Who?
She turned slowly, heart thudding. But it was only Hector. Squatting in a puddle, holding in his mouth something foul-smelling he dug from the trash. Emmy let out a long, relieved sigh.
There you are. Come here.
She scooped him up in her arms, nuzzling his furry back with her chin.
Right, let's get you...
Emmy wanted to cover her ears to block out the awful sounds, but they were so loud, so close. And now she'd found Hector, there was no way she was letting him go again. Clutching him tight to her chest, she turned and ran from the alleyway, intent on making a beeline, straight for home. But now the street wasn't empty at all, but filled with the wild-eyed, shimmering figures of the dead, clawing at the doors of the living, desperate to find shelter before the droids arrived. Emmy thought her heart might burst out of her chest in fright. She wanted to scream, to call for her mother and father, but she was rooted to the spot, frozen solid by sheer terror. Just a few meters away, the ghost of a woman was scratching insistently at the window of old Palfor's hab. In Emmy's arms, Hector issued a terrified chirp.
Shh, Hector,
she hissed. The specter turned her head to look right at Emmy. Her eyes were bright and white, her mouth locked open in a permanent scream. Her hair blowing wildly against the direction of the wind. Emmy could see straight through the ghostly woman's drifting skirts, and as the specter moved, it appeared as though she were underwater, her movements slow and ponderous. Then she screamed and lurched at Emmy, her arms outstretched as if swooping in for a shocking embrace. Emmy ran, charging through the back lanes and darkened streets, clutching Hector to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. All she knew was that she needed to get as far away from the ghostly woman as possible. She didn't care where. Yet everywhere she turned, there were more of the awful figures. Crowding around the homes of the living, even as the ever-present roar of the droid army came on. Relentless and terrifying. Breathing hard, unsure where she was or where to go, Emmy ducked under a broken door, scrambling through a hole on her knees, just like Hector when he'd escaped from the hab. On the other side, the room was cavernous and still and filled with strange, angular shapes. The sounds of the battle seemed distant now, and as she caught her breath, her eyes began to adjust to the gloom. She was in a workshop, surrounded by hunks of broken speeders, carcasses of ancient droids, and what looked like the engine cell of a starship. Chains hung from winches on the ceiling, and strange tools were scattered about the various workbenches that lined the walls. She could hide in here, wait out the night. Something scratched at the broken door behind her. A low moan seemed to seep through the wood, ringing in her ears. They'd found her, already. Panicked, Emmy glanced around for somewhere to hide. There, in the corner, the shell of an antique pill droid, its head balanced lopsidedly on the body's rim. Hurriedly, she clambered inside, holding Hector safe, pulling the head over her like a lid as she ducked down. A patch of the outer shell had worn through with rust, and she peered out into the darkness beyond, her breathing heavy and ragged in her ears. Hector was trembling in her arms. As she watched, a wispy form seemed to flood under the door, forming a puddle of ethereal light and smoke on the ground just inside the workshop. She stared in horror as it began to rise up and take shape, a ghastly figure rebuilding itself out of nothingness. Slowly, it gathered into the form of a stoop-backed Bith that issued a low, monotonous moan as it scoured the workshop in search of her. Emmy tried to steady her breathing. Sweat was beading on her forehead, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. What had she done? She was going to die out here and become one of those terrible things trapped for eternity to relive this horror every life day while her family was left open to attack. The window she had forgotten to shut, flapping in the breeze. But then the ghost seemed to turn away, and for a moment her heart soared. Perhaps it had worked. She could stay in here all night, hidden away, safe in the darkness. Hector kicked his legs, trying to wriggle free of her grip. She patted him gently, willing him to remain calm, but then he gave a shrill whimper and leapt from her grasp, scrabbling at the droid's lid until it slid free, clanging loudly to the floor. He perched on the rim of the droid's shell, trembling, rigid with terror. Emmy peered out through the gap. The ghost had gone. With a huge sigh of relief, she got to her feet, scooping up the frightened Vorpak. She was about to chastise him when the low moaning of the ghost filled her ears again. And suddenly it was rushing her from across the room, charging through the air, long fingers clutching for her face. Emmy screamed, squeezing her eyes shut as the horrible apparition swept over her. This, she knew, was it. Her parents had been right. She should never have chased after Hector. She waited for the pain to come, for the sense of weightlessness, to become a ghost. But nothing happened. After a moment, Emmy opened her eyes. The workshop was gone. She was standing on a street corner out in the town. The light was bright, but she realized, with shock, that it wasn't sunlight. It was the flare of hundreds of blasters and the flames of buildings slowly burning to the ground. All around her, people ran, pursued by tall, spindly droids barking strange commands in odd electronic voices. But these people weren't ghosts. They were real. Emmy started forward, reaching out to grab the arm of a man who was rushing past, but her hand seemed to miss somehow as the man hurried on, crying out in horror and pain. Frowning, Emmy chased after him, but he was already gone. She called out to a young woman who had fallen in the street and was crawling away from the oncoming droids, telling her,
Get up! Hurry! Come and hide in the nearby alleyway with me.
But the woman couldn't hear Emmy over her own screaming. Emmy flinched as a blaster shot seared the side of a building close to her head and ran. Confused, knowing only that she had to get away from the droids. And then suddenly a spindly, stoop-backed Bith was in the road before her. He held up a hand, urging her to stop. But this was the ghost who had found her in the workshop, and she screamed, adding her voice to those of the crowd, running. Her feet pounded the dirt road. Every breath burned. She didn't know how long she'd been running, only that she had to keep going or the droids would get her. She felt swept up in the tide of panic. And then the Bith was in the road ahead of her again. And her vision seemed to narrow until she could see nothing else. She tried to turn away, but her view snapped back to the Bith. She tried to stop, but her feet kept on moving, pushing her forward. She screamed, but it was a hollow sound.
Leave me alone.
Suddenly, she was standing before him. He looked down at her with his glossy black eyes.
Why are you so scared?
He said. Emmy stared at him with a mix of horror and disbelief.
Isn't it obvious?
She shouted, and her voice sounded as though it was coming from 1,000 miles away. The Bith shook his head.
No, not you, the town. Why is everyone so scared?
Emmy swallowed.
Because every life day you come for us, to drag us from our homes and make us all like you.
She said.
Because of the horrible thing that happened to you here on this day.
She gestured at the battle going on all around them.
That's why we're scared.
Confusion creased the Bith's bulbous forehead.
We're not here to scare you.
What?
Until the droids came, this was our happiest day of the year.
The scene shifted once more. The massacre was gone, replaced with dancing and laughter, a band playing in the square and voices raised in song.
Every year we would celebrate and share joy with our families and friends.
The Bith explained as one vision of Life Day followed another, each more joyous than the last. A kaleidoscope of jubilation and happiness.
But now all you do is hide yourselves away, locking your doors to your neighbors. That is why we visit you, to remind you to live.
But what about the droids?
Asked Emmy, barely able to stay on her feet as the town spun around her.
Why do their ghosts come as well?
They don't,
said the Bith.
The droids were never alive, so they can't really have ghosts, can they?
He made a noise that might have been a chuckle.
Only one thing haunts the people of Ods Town, your grief. You dwell on what was, rather than what will be, conjuring the battle because of your sadness and fear.
So, you're saying all of this is because of us? Because of the way we see you?
Said Emmy, but the Bith's reply was lost amongst the whirling visions of celebrations past, the images blurring, mixing with the sounds of explosions and blaster fire.
Wait!
Emmy cried, reaching out a hand to steady herself, but all at once the shadows of the past were gone, as was the Bith. Emmy found herself still in the shell of the old pill droid, clutching clutching Hector to her chest. Outside in the streets, the sound of the ghostly battle raged on. But now she knew what she had to do. Grinning, Emmy rushed from the workshop out into the cold night. Around her, phantoms stirred, turning their wailing faces towards her, but she simply smiled, hurrying by. She would start on her own street. The ghosts were everywhere, clawing at the doors, scratching at the boarded-up windows, but Emmy paid them no heed as she ran along the street, thumping on people's doors as she did.
It's all right.
She bellowed, bursting with excitement.
You can come out. It's safe now. Come out and say hello.
Doors began to crack open.
Emmy, is that you? What are you doing?
Lights flickered on all along the street.
We've forgotten what Life Day is all about. We've spent so long hiding in the darkness that we've given up on the light. We need to celebrate life, not be trapped by death.
Emmy twirled in the street, shouting at the top of her lungs.
Life Day is about hope. Come on out and see for yourselves. It's all right. I promise. They won't hurt us.
Around Emmy, the sounds of the battle were dying away. The ghosts had begun to fall back from the doorways and windows, their expressions softening to smiles. Slowly, people stepped out from their dwellings into the street, peering in wonder at the flock of specters, now waving and laughing as more and more of the living joined them outside. Somewhere on the wind, music played and voices sang. Laughter filled Emmy's ears, the laughter of the living, not the long dead. A hand fell on her shoulder.
Emmy, we've been so worried. What did you think you were doing, sneaking out like that?
It's okay, Dad.
She said, grinning up at her father.
They're not here to hurt us. They only want us to be happy again.
Together they looked on as the ghosts, still smiling, slowly faded away into the night. And all along the street and throughout the town, people raised their voices in a cheer. So, it was said that from that day forth, the people of Ods Town kept Life Day better than all others on Manta. And every year, a young girl and her Vorpak would be out in the streets, searching the alleyways until she spotted an old, stoop-backed Bith who would smile and wave before quietly fading away. This audiobook was developed 100% using artificial intelligence to generate realistic and familiar voices.